And that story is found in the book of Ruth. So, I think what happened is when the Bible is being put together, God inspired all this scripture, and you go through something like Judges, and you have a lot of fighting and a lot of gore and violence, and that's kind of interesting to men. And so now there's a nice story for women to come along and to enjoy. So, today in the book of Ruth, I want to go through the story, and I want to look at three characters in the book, the three main characters, and they are going to teach us about godly traits. Each of these characters has a very important godly trait, and I want to learn from each of them as we go through the story. So if you want to look at Ruth, chapter 1, starting in verse 1, it gives us the background of the whole story, and it introduces us to the first character. Her name is Naomi. In Ruth 1, verse 1, it tells us, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there." Now, first character in the story is Naomi, and Naomi has a very, very important characteristic, a very godly trait, and that is that Naomi is very committed to God. She's very faithful to God. Now, any romance story needs to have a strong, independent female lead. However, Naomi was that, but it was not by her own choice. Naomi was the victim of some very, very sad circumstances. To really understand exactly what's going on, we need to understand the culture of the time, too. And now Naomi, her husband has died, her 2 sons married, but then her 2 sons died, and sure, she has a lot of problems with the pain of loss, but really her situation goes beyond just the pain of loss. You see, in this ancient culture, women did not have the same opportunities that they do today. And as a result, a woman could not easily provide for herself and take care of herself. She couldn't just go to the store and apply for a job there if she needed something. Really, in this time, a woman had to be attached to a man in order to be taken care of. And that's a big problem for Naomi, considering that her husband had died. Now, if a woman was not attached to a man or not attached to her husband, she could be attached to her father or to a brother. But if she didn't have those people, well, she was in trouble. She would have to find ways to just barely scrape by, or resort to begging, or resort to prostitution or something like that in order just to make a living. And so, Naomi is in this very bad circumstance, but this is what is absolutely remarkable about Naomi. That is that even in the midst of all of her bad situation, she still exhibits faithfulness to God. Now, granted, we do realize that she does have some bouts with her faith, some questions, some issues, but ultimately, throughout her doubt and all of her trouble, she never really completely abandons God. In fact, in Ruth 2, verse 20, when she sees God doing good things, she says of Him, He has not stopped showing His kindness to the living and the dead, being her and her deceased husband. She recognizes that God is still there, He still cares for her, He's still working with her. She is faithful to God. And real faithfulness is faithfulness despite circumstances. You know, Abraham is so commended for being a faithful person. Abraham lived he was in his 80s and 90s when God told him, "You're going to have a son." And even in the midst of his circumstances, he still believed, well, I guess I'm going to have a son. Even though I'm old, even though my wife is old, God can still make it happen. And so he was faithful. 2 Samuel 22:26 tells us, "To the faithful you show yourself faithful." And that's true. God showed Himself faithful to Abraham. He fulfilled His promise and gave him a son, even in old age. And God showed Himself faithful to Naomi, too. Even though Naomi had some terrible circumstances, God still provided for her. But we'll get into specifically how a little later in the story. You see, faithfulness is a really godly trait. When a person trusts God, they honor God, and they serve God despite their circumstances, then we would call them a godly person. But I've been wording this very, very carefully so far. Faithfulness is not just a person who is faithful to God despite bad circumstances, but despite all circumstances. You see, I think there's actually something that poses more of a threat to our faith at times than even a hard trial that we might go through. And I think that's incredible abundance. You know, historically speaking, whenever the church was under persecution, it thrived. When people were having the worst times, they were actually being the best Christians. I think it's because it convinced people that they were in this for keeps, and they got more serious about their faith. But too often, when people are blessed abundantly, well, they can kind of tend to become lax and to start to backslide. And I think that's why Jesus said it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to get through the eye of a needle. There's so many things there to distract them. But to people who remain committed to God despite their circumstances, we bestow the title of faithful. You know, the preacher Fred Craddock gave an analogy on what it means to really be faithful and be committed to God. He said, if you had a $1,000 bill, and this is not a $1,000 bill, if somebody wants to help me out with that, I'll gladly let you. But if you had a $1,000 bill, oftentimes we think of faithfulness, commitment to God, as if we take that $1,000 and all at once just lay it down and say, there, God, you can have it. But that's actually very unlikely to what's going to happen in our lives. More likely, real faithfulness to God would be more like taking that $1,000 to the bank and changing it into quarters, and throughout our entire life, carrying a sack of quarters around and constantly giving out a little bit at a time for our entire life. It's constant commitment. It's giving out 25 cents here to a friend who needs help. It's giving out 25 cents there to someone who needs someone to listen to them. You see, faithfulness to God is not a one-time instantaneous thing, but rather a lifetime marathon. So the question is, how do we become faithful to God? How do we be more faithful? Well, Psalm 31:23 says, love the Lord, all His saints. The Lord preserves the faithful. Well, love is certainly a part of faithfulness, or faithfulness is certainly a part of love, rather, we should say. Love God always. But remember this, real love is something that is expressed in action. Real love is consistently being willing to serve God. It's consistently prioritizing what He wants. It's consistently pursuing a deeper relationship with Him. It's consistently recognizing that there is an entire world outside of our church, outside of our community, that does not know Christ, and that He wants us to introduce them to Him. See, faithfulness is not easy because it has to be consistent for the long run. But when we are faithful, God will always be faithful back to us. So Naomi has that incredible quality. She's very faithful to God. Well, let's look at the next main character in our text. And her name is Ruth. Now, Ruth has another very important quality. If you look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 14, we get to see a glimpse of what Ruth's very good godly quality is. Now, at this time, Naomi, after her husband, her sons have died, she's told her daughter-in-laws, Ruth and I can't remember her other daughter-in-law's name, Ruth and her other daughter-in-law, to go back to their families and be taken care of there. However, Ruth doesn't do that. Now, her other daughter-in-law, Orpah, she does do that, but Ruth decides not to. In verse 14, it tells us, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Now Ruth has another incredible quality, and that is that she is faithful to other people. Naomi was very faithful to God. Ruth is incredibly faithful to others. In this case, it is Naomi. Now remember, we said in this time, a woman really needed to be attached to a man for her well-being. Well, we can gather from the story that Ruth is young. Her parents are probably still alive. She could go back and she could live with her father or with a brother and be taken care of after her husband died. But instead of doing that, instead of taking the easy option, she decides to stick with Naomi. You see, she's more committed and faithful than your average person. And faithfulness and commitment, that is, having that faithfulness towards others, that really is a very godly trait as well. Ephesians 5:1 tells us, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children. And after all, God is immensely faithful to us, even when we don't deserve it. So should it really be so hard to be faithful to others? Rather, our faithfulness should be so strong, so evident, that it should actually point to our faith in God. John 13:34, Jesus said, "As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples." Because of the love, the faithfulness that we show to each other. And faithfulness is certainly a part of love. There should be something so obvious about the way that we treat others that people know whose we are. And the fact is, faithfulness is a very rare thing today. You know, around 50% of marriages end in divorce. Around 50% of married people have an affair at some time in their lives. After they graduate, 60% of high school students stop attending church. They don't have the faithfulness to continue on. You know, the number of worldwide abortions every day is 115,000. If a woman doesn't want her child, instead of remaining faithful to the child and to the commitment, she just kills it. I want to read a quote that I found. This is written by a real person who's apparently having some problems with faithfulness. Now, a real person wrote this. She wrote, "I love my husband, but I keep thinking about another guy I used to date. How on earth could I love them both? I fear if I'm still having feelings for the other guy from my past, who is also married now, then maybe I shouldn't have gotten married until those feelings were gone. But the thing is, I didn't know I still had them until recently. The other guy is in my thoughts constantly. I just miss him." And she ends it by asking the question, what am I going to do? I love my husband and don't want to hurt him or lose him. Now, it doesn't bother me that woman remembered that she dated some other guy before. It doesn't bother me that she happens to think that she's attracted to some other guy. What bothers me is that when that happens, her immediate response is, well, should I leave my husband? Should I consider throwing my marriage away, having this other guy throw his marriage away so that I can pursue these feelings? There's really no faithfulness. I'm sure she would classify that as following her heart, but really it was just a lack of faithfulness to others. Here's the thing. If we stand as models for faithfulness, people will notice. Because the world has so little faithfulness in it as it is. And the way we show faithfulness to others is the same way we show faithfulness to God. It is by active love. That means that we put the needs of others above our own. That means we treat the most annoying guy at work as a friend. That means we prioritize our marriage above every other relationship that we have. That's what's so important, is that faithfulness. And Ruth was very good at exhibiting that godly quality. So with that said, let's get back to the story now, and let me explain what's going on. Ruth, being so committed, she goes back to Israel with Naomi, her mother-in-law. So it's two single women struggling to survive, and they're barely able to scrape by because Ruth, being younger than Naomi, being more able to work, she goes out into other people's fields, and she gleans wheat out of their field. Now, in the Old Testament, the Israelites were commanded to be considerate of the poor in their community. And one way that they were told to do that was when they went through and they harvested in their field or in their vineyards, they were supposed to go through once and harvest, and then they weren't supposed to go back and get what they missed. They were supposed to leave whatever they missed the first time for the poor people, and the people who couldn't take care of themselves, they could come through and glean some and have something to eat that way. Or they weren't supposed to get right up against the edge of their field and get right by the wall and get every little every stalk of grain. They were supposed to leave that for people who might need it more. And so that's basically how Ruth and Naomi are surviving. They're living on whatever is left over. Well, one day, Ruth goes into the field of a man named Boaz. And Boaz provides the next very important element for any romance story, and that is the love interest. Now, I've come to the conclusion every story, every movie, every book you read today is going to have some sort of love interest. Just the type of story is going to depend on that love interest. Now, in a romance story, ultimately, the protagonist and the love interest will end up together and they'll be happy. In an action movie, the love interest will get kidnapped and be rescued by the protagonist. In a horror movie, the love interest will probably be killed. But there's a love interest in every single story that you ever hear. Now, the important thing that we realize is that Boaz just so happens to be a relative of Elimelech, who is Naomi's deceased husband. And that is very important here in a little while. So in Ruth chapter 2, verse 8, we get a glimpse of Boaz's godly characteristic. He says to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls." You skip down to verse 14. It says, "At mealtime, Boaz said to her, 'Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar.' When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to go glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, 'Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her.'" Now here is Boaz's godly characteristic. He is very, very compassionate. Boaz sees that Ruth is a hard worker. He admires that. But he also knows about her situation, how she's neglected, or she's not neglected, she's left her own family so that she can stay and take care of her mother-in-law. She's refused to neglect Naomi. And that's such a godly characteristic. And Boaz has compassion on her because of her difficult situation. And the way he shows his compassion is very generously. He lets her eat with him and his workers. He gives her some of the food. He tells her to stay in his field where she can guarantee that she'll be safe. If she were to go out to another field, there's no guarantee that someone might not try to hurt her or take advantage of her in some way. And he even tells his servants, kind of behind her back, he tells the servants, when you're binding up the sheaves, pull out a few stalks of grain and leave it so that she'll have a little bit more to take home with her. You see, his compassion is that he does something else for someone in need. Well, Boaz is a very compassionate man, but let's look at the rest of the story. Now, here's the rest of the love story. Ruth goes home, tells Naomi what happens, and Naomi says, "Boaz is a relative of ours." Now, what that means is that it classifies Boaz, he has the potential now to be what is called the kinsman redeemer, which is an Old Testament concept, and it was something that people would do in this time basically to help out their own family. It was commanded that a kinsman redeemer would be the person who would basically bail out a family member who was in trouble. If I spent too much money, went into debt, had to sell myself as a slave, my closest relative, who was able and who was willing, we'll say my brother, would have to come and would have to spend his money and bail me out, buy my freedom back, pay off my debts. The kinsman redeemer paid off the debt of a family member who couldn't do it. Also, if a man married a woman and he died before he was ever able to have children with her, a kinsman redeemer's job in this time was to marry his widow and to have children with her. Now, the first son he would produce would also be considered technically the son of his dead relative, of his wife's first husband, because he was doing a service to his relative by providing an heir and providing someone to carry on the family name and to take care of his mother. You see, kinsman redeemer was a very important job in this time, and Boaz has the potential to be that. So, Naomi starts to scheme a little bit, and she sets up Ruth on a date with Boaz, a blind date. Well, it's blind to Boaz, not really blind to Ruth. She sends him to go on this date, and they have a nice, good, innocent date and spend the night talking. And they have a problem, though. As any good romance story is going to have, there has to be some reason that the protagonist and the love interest can't be together. And Boaz realizes that there is a problem here. That problem is that there is another relative who is actually closer relation to Elimelech than Boaz. So this guy has the right to be the kinsman redeemer before Boaz. So Boaz takes care of that. He sets up a meeting with this guy and the elders. They sit down and talk. And he says, your deceased relative's wife is selling a piece of land. Do you want it? You can redeem it. He said, yeah, I want to redeem it. He says, by the way, if you redeem it, you have to take her family as well. He said, no, I don't want to redeem it. So Boaz offered to take the responsibility of kinsman redeemer from this relative who is unnamed. And here's the thing. I think it is the compassion that Boaz has for Ruth that gets him to actually take on this role. And you know, this concept of kinsman redeemer actually has quite a bit of application in the New Testament as well. For starters, Boaz had a whole lot in common with Jesus. First, they were both men of compassion. All throughout the Bible, all throughout the book of Matthew, the compassion of Jesus is a running theme. Matthew 9:36 says that when Jesus saw crowds, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. In Matthew 14:14, he saw a large crowd and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Matthew 15:32, he said, I have compassion for these people because they've been with me for 3 days and haven't eaten. Matthew 20:34, Jesus had compassion on 2 blind men and healed them. They both were men of extreme compassion. But second, here's the second thing that Jesus and Boaz have in common. They both had compassion that led them to take on the role of kinsman redeemer. You see, this entire concept of kinsman redeemer helps us to understand exactly what God did through Christ. We had an enormous debt of sin to pay that we were unable to pay. So God became our kin by becoming a man. And He was the only man who was in any position to pay off that debt. He was perfect and sinless, and He represented God as well. So Christ really served as our kinsman redeemer when He paid our debt for sin. Ephesians 4:32 says, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Christ's sacrifice was the greatest gift of compassion God has ever given. We were like those little redeemable Coke bottles. I didn't know they existed until I went on a mission trip to Mexico several years ago. You could buy Coke bottles you could throw away. You could pay a few more cents for the ones that you could take back to the store, give to the guy, and he would give you a few cents in return for the Coke bottles. You could redeem them because there was still a value in them. And God certainly saw a value in us, and He redeemed us as well. Here's the thing we need to know from that. 1 John 3:17 says, if anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? In other words, if you don't have compassion for your fellow man, are you even aware of the compassion that God had for you? That compassion is such an important and such a godly trait. So, the story of Ruth is important for several reasons. It teaches us a little bit more about this concept of kinsman redeemer, gives us some insight into that. It foreshadows God's work through Jesus, but also it teaches us about some very good qualities. Faithfulness to God, faithfulness to others, compassion. And it teaches us something special about people who have these qualities, and that is that God works through godly people. God works through godly people. Now we may say, how was God working through the people in this situation? Well, the very end of the story. The guy gets his girl, or the girl gets his guy, I guess, gets her guy in this case. Boaz and Ruth end up getting married. They have a son, and as the kinsman redeemer, Boaz gives his son technically to Naomi, his wife's former mother-in-law, and now Naomi can raise a child and have a son of her own who will help take care of her. And so essentially, Naomi is redeemed by that. But it was this child whose descendant ended up being the king of Israel, David. And it was David's descendant who ended up being the king of the world, Jesus. And you see, God was working back behind the scenes, fine-tuning everything to get things to work in such a way that He could bring Christ into the world. And He did it all through godly people. God works through godly people.